It's late. Whatever you should be doing, it can wait. You found the graveyard slot, stories for the hours nobody claims. It's just us now. Tonight's story, the name in the Bible. It arrived with a photocopy page from a family Bible folded inside. The original, she writes, doesn't leave the house. We read them as written. Let's begin. I taught third grade for 34 years, which means I spent 3.5 decades listening to 8-year-olds tell me things that weren't, strictly speaking, factual. A dog that could talk, a grandmother who was secretly a spy, little brother who didn't exist and never had, and learning, the hard and necessary way, which of those stories were make-believe and which ones were a child trying to hand you something true, using the only vocabulary they had left. I bring this up first because it turned out to be the only training I had that mattered for what happened in my father's kitchen this spring. And because I want you to understand that I did not come to this as a credulous woman. I came to it as someone who has spent her whole professional life sorting one kind of story from the other. I got it wrong anyway, for the better part of 2 months, in exactly the way you'd expect a daughter to get it wrong about her own father. I moved back into the house I grew up in on the 2nd of April. Into my childhood bedroom, which my mother had turned into a sewing room decades before, and which I turned back, over one long weekend, into a place a 61-year-old woman could sleep. My father, Edwin, is 87. He was diagnosed 2 years ago with vascular dementia, the kind that comes in a slow tide rather than a single flood, good days, bad days, and a general erosion underneath both that you only really notice if you're the one measuring the tide line daily, which by April I was. My mother, Louise, died 6 years ago, and it had been Paul, my older brother, and a rotation of home health aides holding things together since, until the arrangement stopped holding. I quit nothing to come home. I'd already retired the June before, a whole life of report cards and parent conferences folded up and put away, and I told myself, driving the 2 hours back to Oberville with my car packed to the roofline, that this was simply the next chapter, the one where I took care of the man who'd once sat up with me through chickenpox and taught me to drive a stick shift in the church parking lot. There was no job on the line for me in any of this, I should say plainly. No supervisor, no schedule. Nothing but a promise I'd made to my mother in her last week, holding her hand in a hospital room that smelled like everyone's last week. Smells. Don't let 'em go into a home if you can help it, Frankie. Keep 'em where things are. I came home for love, not money, and I want that distinction on the record clearly before I tell you the rest, because everything that follows only makes sense if you understand that I had every reason in the world to want my father's stories to be nothing but a symptom, and every reason to fight, for as long as I possibly could, against believing they were anything else. The house itself had barely changed, which was its own kind of quiet shock the first week. My mother's day of the week dish towels still hung in the same order on the same oven handle, Monday through Sunday, faded but present, and I found myself, without deciding to, keeping the rotation going, because it felt like the smallest possible way to keep something of hers correctly ordered when so much else in that house was coming slowly undone. I set up a pill organizer on the counter by the coffee maker, the kind with a little door for each day, and a chore chart taped inside the pantry door listing which nights got which frozen casserole, and a cork board by the phone with emergency numbers pinned in my own handwriting over the ghost of my mother's, because the same cork board had held her numbers for 40 years, and I couldn't bring myself to take the whole board down, only to layer my numbers over hers, still faintly visible underneath if you tilted the cork toward the window. I tell you all of this domestic bookkeeping not because it matters on its own, but because I want you to understand the register I was living in for those first weeks. Casseroles, towels, a corkboard, the particular unglamorous administration of loving somebody who is starting to leave you a piece at a time. Nothing about my days had the shape of a mystery. They had the shape of a chore list, and I was, for those first 2 weeks, entirely at peace inside that shape. The county sends a respite nurse, Deb, twice a week. And Deb gave me a 3-ring binder in my first week that I have come to think of as the official version of my father. Medication schedule, fall risk notes, a laminated page titled Understanding Dementia-Related Confusion, that I read start to finish twice before I'd even unpacked my books. The binder was clear on one point above all others. Confabulation, it's called. When a person with dementia fills the gaps in their memory with details that feel completely true to them and are not true at all, not lies exactly, because a lie requires knowing better, just the brain doing its best with damaged material. Deb told me kindly, standing in my mother's kitchen with her hand on my arm, that the cruelest and most common mistake families make is arguing with the confabulation, correcting it, insisting on the real version, when the better and gentler thing is almost always to let it be, to redirect, to keep the person calm. She gave me examples from other families on her rounds, almost comforting in how ordinary they were. A man convinced every morning that he still needed to drive to a job he'd retired from 30 years prior. A woman who set a place at dinner for a husband who'd been gone a decade. Both of them managed the same way, gently, without correction, until the thought passed on its own like weather. I wrote all of it down, too. I want you to know I took it as seriously as anything anyone has ever told me, because I believed it, and because for the first 2 weeks it was true of everything my father said. He was wonderful those first 2 weeks, in the specific way people are wonderful when you haven't yet learned the shape of what's failing in them. He remembered every hymn number from church back in 1974. He remembered the exact model of tractor his own father drove, and the year it threw a rod in the north field. He remembered my mother's maiden name, her sister's maiden name, the price of a loaf of bread the year they married. Where he faltered was the present tense, what he'd had for breakfast, whether I'd already visited that day, occasionally in the earliest and gentlest way, who I was, correcting himself half a beat later with an embarrassed laugh. Of course, Marianne, my eyes aren't what they were. All of that was in the binder. All of that I was ready for. He was also, and this is the part no binder prepares you for because no binder is interested in it, still simply my father, funny in the same dry register he'd always been funny in, patient with me in ways I hadn't expected to need. My second morning home, he caught me trying to fix the sticking latch on the screen door with a butter knife and a great deal of profanity, and he came out onto the porch in his robe, took the knife gently out of my hand, and showed me the trick his own father had shown him on that same door sometime in the Eisenhower administration. Lift and turn at once. Don't force it square. And then stood there in the April cold in his slippers, clearly pleased with himself, clearly enjoying being the one who still knew something I didn't. He asked after my former students by name, some of them 30 years gone from my classroom and grown now into people he'd never met, because I'd told him about them at dinner over the years, and he had, it turned out, actually been listening the whole time, filing away which ones went on to be nurses and which ones got into trouble, and he'd ask, apropos of nothing over coffee, whether I'd ever heard what became of the boy who cried during the class hamster's funeral. He still did the crossword every morning in pen, filling in only the answers he was certain of, leaving the rest blank rather than guess, a habit of intellectual honesty I found unbearably moving once I understood how much more of the puzzle was going blank each week. He also, without my ever once asking him to, kept my mother's rose bushes along the side fence pruned and fed on her old schedule, a chore he could no longer always remember having just finished, so that some mornings I would find him out there twice, secateurs in hand, tending roses that had already been tended, and I came to understand that some part of him was determined to keep faith with her care of things, even in the specific places his memory could no longer promise him. He already kept it. I'm telling you this now, out of order, because it belongs on the record before anything else happens to him in this account. He was not a diagnosis wearing my father's face. He was my father, fully, for most of every day, and the disease was a visitor in his house rather than the other way around, and I would need to hold on to that fact hard in the weeks ahead, because it would have been so much easier and so much less honest to let him become only the sum of what he was starting to lose. It was the second week, a Thursday, bright and ordinary, sun coming hard through the east window over the sink, the way it does in our kitchen every afternoon in April, that he asked me, buttering toast at the table like it was the most unremarkable question in the world, whether I'd remembered to bring Francis in from the porch. It was 51 degrees outside. I told him, easy, redirecting the way Deb's binder said to, that nobody was out on the porch, that it was just us today, and he nodded and let it go and ate his toast. and I wrote asked about Francis, possible confabulated sibling, redirect successful in the little notebook Deb had asked me to keep in the same flat handwriting I used to use for spelling test scores. I did not have a sister named Francis. I did not have a sister at all. I had Paul, 4 years older, and that was the whole of it. The whole shape of our family as I had understood it my entire life. This is the first detail that mattered, though at the time I gave it no weight whatsoever. A symptom, filed, moved past, the exact reasonable response any daughter with a laminated binder would have had. He asked about Frances 4 more times that week. Was she warm enough? Had she been fed? Once, memorably, whether Marianne, meaning me, I assumed, though I've had cause since to wonder, had remembered to check on Frances before bed, phrased in a way that made the two of us sound like a team assigned to the same small, ongoing responsibility. Each time I redirected, gently, the way the binder said, and each time it worked, and each time I told myself, this was simply where the disease had decided to put its roots this month. The way it had put them in tractors and hymn numbers the month before. Frances was, as far as I was concerned, an invention with no more weight than a made-up dog. I did not go looking for her. I had no reason to. The looking started by accident, the way these things generally do, which I've come to think is one of the true horrors of it. I wasn't hunting for anything. I was clearing my mother's sewing hutch to make room for a hospital bed the doctor thought we'd need by summer, and at the bottom of a drawer full of buttons and bias tape, I found the family Bible, the big one with the padded burgundy cover, the one I remembered mostly for the pressed violets my mother used to keep between the pages of Psalms. I hadn't opened it in decades. I sat down on the sewing room floor with dust on my knees and turned to the family record pages at the front, the ones with the fading gilt border for births, marriages, deaths, more out of nostalgia than any purpose, expecting to see my own birth, Paul's, my parents' wedding date, in my grandmother's careful hand. I saw those, and beneath my line, in the same ink, in what I recognized after a moment as my mother's own handwriting rather than my grandmother's, was a third entry, a name, Frances Louise Kessler. A birth date I did the arithmetic on twice before I trusted it, the same week as mine to the day. No death date entered in the column meant for one, and through the name itself, one confident, deliberate line, drawn with enough pressure that it had scored faintly into the next page. I sat on that floor a long time. My first thought was not fear, though I'd like to tell you it was. My first thought, God help me, was a kind of relief. Oh, so that's where he got the name. It's not invented. It's a genuine old family name he's pulling up from somewhere real, which is exactly the kind of generous, tidy, teacherly explanation I'd have accepted from a student and should have distrusted from myself. I called Paul that evening, keeping my voice light and offhand, and asked if he remembered a baby named Francis. The same tone I'd have used asking about a lost recipe card. He was quiet on the line long enough that I noticed it before he answered. Then he said, too fast that he didn't know what I was talking about, that Dad mixes up names constantly now. Church lady names, old customer names from the feed store, and that I shouldn't go poking around in old business while I was trying to keep the man calm and settled. He has always been the one in our family most invested in things being settled. I let it go. I told myself he was right, that I was a woman under strain doing exactly what Deb's binder warned against, treating confabulation as a mystery instead of a symptom, and I put the Bible back in the drawer and did not open it again for a week. But you cannot unfind a thing like that, not really, and once you found it, it turns out to recruit other memories you'd filed elsewhere without ever noticing they belonged in the same drawer. 3 of them came to me that week, unbidden, while I was doing something else entirely. Wiping counters, folding my father's undershirts, the way a name you can't place will surface at 2 a.m, 3 days after someone asked you for it. The first was my own birth certificate, which I'd pulled the year before for a passport renewal and barely glanced at beyond the date and the raised seal. It lists, in the box for plurality, the word twin. I remembered noticing it at the license counter and thinking, with the mild irritation you feel toward government paperwork generally, that some clerk back in 1965 had fat-fingered a box and moving on, because I am an only younger child with one older brother and there was no twin anywhere in any conversation I'd ever had in my life. and clerical errors on 60-year-old documents did not strike me at the time as worth a phone call to the county. The second was a photograph that has sat in a silver frame on my parents' piano for as long as I have been alive. One I have dusted more times than I could count and looked at perhaps twice with any real attention. It shows two bassinets side by side in what is unmistakably this house's front parlor, the wallpaper unchanged in the background even now. One bassinet holds an infant, clearly, unmistakably, eyes open toward the camera. The second bassinet is draped in a blanket up over what could be its rim, could be its contents, could be nothing at all. I had always assumed, without ever once actually testing the assumption, that it was empty, a prop, a spare left over from the store. Because why would there be two? The third was older than either document, older than anything with ink on it. My own earliest memory, the one people ask you about at dinner parties, the marker you set down as the first thing you can genuinely recall, rather than a memory of being told a story. Mine has always been this, standing in a doorway, too short to see over a crib rail. My mother's voice above me, singing something low and off-key with a nonsense word in it. I could never place as belonging to any real hymn or lullaby. Afternoon light coming in gold and heavy the way it only does in that house in October. And the specific, total certainty held my whole life without examination, that she was singing it to me. I had never once asked myself how memory works from outside the crib you were supposedly lying in. I had simply never looked at the geometry of it. Once I did, sitting at my father's kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee going colder, the geometry would not resolve back into comfort no matter how I turned it. I was standing at the door. Someone else was in the crib. There was a fourth thing, smaller than the other three, almost too small to count, except that once I'd started noticing I couldn't stop noticing it either. My mother used to call me, on the rare occasions she used anything other than my given name, not the obvious nickname built off Mary Ann, not Mare, though Paul used that, not Ann, which anyone would reach for first, but Frankie, said fondly, said often enough in my childhood that I never once questioned where it came from, the way children never question the private words their parents attach to them. I'd always assumed, when I thought of it at all, that it was simply a sound she liked, a private nonsense affection, the kind every family invents and nobody can trace afterward. Sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee gone properly cold, both hands flat on the wood like I was steadying the table rather than myself, I could not make it sit comfortably in that drawer anymore, and I could not yet say why, only that it belonged with the other three things now. Wherever it was, they were all pointing. My mother had used that name on me my entire childhood, fondly, constantly, and I had never once thought to ask her where it came from. That is, I think, the truest description I can give you of how a family keeps a secret for 61 years. Not vigilance, just never handing the child a reason to wonder. I am by training a careful person, so I did what careful people do, which is go and check the actual records instead of trusting my own unraveling nerves. This part is worth walking through methodically because it's where I stopped being a daughter managing a symptom and became, without entirely choosing to, a woman conducting an investigation into her own life in broad daylight at public counters with library-issued pencils. I went to the Auberville Public Library on a Tuesday, sun so bright on the parking lot I had to squint reading my own dashboard clock, and asked the reference librarian, a patient young man named Curtis, who has helped me find large print mysteries for my father a dozen times since April, how to search the county's birth and death indexes going back to 1965. He set me up in the same back room where I used to bring my third graders on library field trips every October, the one with the good radiator and the microfiche readers. Nobody under 60 had touched in years, and for a moment before he even loaded the first reel I had the strange, dislocating comfort of being back in a room I associated entirely with somebody else's job, checking out a class set of picture books, not searching for evidence of a sister. He showed me how to thread the film and roll the crank, still the fastest route for that era, he said, apologetically, like the county owed me a better system, and then he did the small kindness of leaving me alone with it rather than hovering. The machine hummed, the radiator ticked. Outside the one high window, a maintenance man was edging the library lawn, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I would give a great deal to trade places with him, to spend my Tuesday afternoon worrying about nothing sharper than a crooked line in the grass. I found the birth index entry inside 20 minutes. Kessler, Frances Louise, female, born the same week as me, the same hospital. 4 lines below my own entry, in the same ledger, in the clean type of a clerk's index card rather than my mother's handwriting. She was real. She had been born. The county had logged it the ordinary, bureaucratic, undramatic way a birth gets logged, in a warm room with a ticking radiator on a Tuesday no different from the one I was sitting in. I looked for a matching death index entry next. In the same county, the adjacent counties, the whole state database. Curtis showed me how to search once we'd exhausted the local fiche, and there was nothing. Not a missing document, not a gap in a damaged roll of film. An absence, clean and total, the kind that in 34 years of grading student work I learned to distrust more than any obvious error, because a genuine accident leaves a smudge and a deliberate omission leaves nothing at all. A baby who is born and does not appear again anywhere in any record is not a filing error. She is a story someone stopped telling on purpose. I drove to St. Brendan's the next afternoon, the parish my parents belonged to their whole marriage, the one Paul and I were both baptized in, and asked the woman who keeps the sacramental archive, a retired school teacher herself named Sister Agatha, though she hasn't worn a habit in decades, whether she could find a baptism record under the name Frances Kessler. She found it faster than I expected, in a register bound in cracked green leather, dated 3 days after the birth I just confirmed. Full name, parents named correct, godparents listed, a priest's signature I didn't recognize, and tucked loose into that same page, not bound in, just resting there the way a bookmark rests, was a small yellowed slip in a different, more hurried hand, addressed to whoever might one day open that register, a request that the entry be struck from the permanent record, at family's request, per Monsignor Voss, matter of charity, no further explanation offered, as if the words matter of charity were meant to close the subject rather than open it. Sister Agatha read it over my shoulder and went very quiet and told me, in the careful voice of someone who has decided not to say the next 3 things she's thinking, that in the old days a parish would sometimes do a grieving family that kindness, not erase a baptism, exactly, sacraments don't undo, but pull the paper itself from ordinary view, so a mother wouldn't have to see it every time some clerk pulled the register for an unrelated wedding search. She said she'd never actually seen it done, only heard the practice described by priests older than her. She did not ask me why I wanted it. I think she already half knew, the way people who keep records for a living develop a sense for which questions are really about the asker. I did not tell Paul about the library or St. Brendan's, and it matters that I didn't. I had stopped believing, by that second week of looking, that his caution was really about protecting Dad's calm. I think he already knew there was something to find, and was hoping I wouldn't be the kind of sister who found it. I had been exactly that kind of sister my whole life, overspelling tests and property lines, and now this, and I don't know, even now, whether I'm sorry. My father's afternoons over those same weeks were not degrading the way Deb's binder had trained me to expect. They were sharpening, on this one subject only, the way a photograph left too long in a drawer will sometimes come up clearer than the day it was printed, because nothing has been touching it. At lunch one Thursday, unprompted, buttering toast the same way he had the very first time he mentioned her, he told me that Frances had been small enough the week she was born to share the newborn photograph bassinet with her sister for one frame before the photographer repositioned them, a detail so oddly, needlessly specific, so entirely unlike the vague confabulation Deb's binder described, that I sat across from him with my own toast going cold and understood I was not listening to a broken record anymore. I was listening to testimony. I had spent 34 years learning exactly how to tell the difference between a child inventing a story to fill a gap and a child describing something real in the only language available to them. And my father, buttering toast in the bright, ordinary light of his own kitchen, was doing the second thing, not the first. I started recording our afternoon conversations on my phone after that, propped against the sugar bowl. Told him it was for Deb, for his chart, which wasn't entirely a lie. I told myself I was gathering data the way I once gathered a running record on a struggling reader, Not because I believed in anything beyond the ordinary sad mechanics of an old man's mind, but because if there was a real story underneath the confabulation, I wanted it captured before it degraded past recovery. The same reflex that makes people finally switch on a tape recorder for an elderly relative, once they sense there isn't much family history left to lose. That was the frame I put around it, sitting at that table with the recorder running. I did not yet understand what kind of recording it was going to turn out to be. I finally cornered Paul on a Sunday call, the two of us 65 and 61 now, both bruised in the specific way middle-aged siblings get bruised circling something old enough to predate either of their adult selves, and I told him flatly what I'd found: the register, the removal slip, the missing death record, the newborn photograph. I told him I wasn't going to be redirected this time. He was quiet again, longer than before, and when he finally spoke his voice had lost the fast, managing quality it usually has and gone thin instead, the voice of a man setting down something heavy. He's been carrying since he was 4 years old, because he would have been 4, old enough to half remember, not old enough to understand what he was remembering. He said there had been a sick baby a long time before me. No. He corrected himself there, and I heard the correction happen in real time. A stumble he covered so quickly I almost missed it. Before you were both born, he said, and moved past it, and I let him. Because I needed the rest of the sentence more than I needed to chase that one slip. He said mother could never speak of it, not once, not to him, not to anyone, that it was the one subject in a house otherwise unafraid of hard subjects that stayed permanently closed. He said the family's private arrangement, his word arrangement, delivered like a term he'd inherited rather than one he'd chosen, had been worked out quietly between our parents, a country doctor willing to be flexible with a record in that year, and a parish priest willing to do a grieving family what he considered a mercy, rather than mark the loss and carry it forward the ordinary way, openly, with a grave and a date and a name spoken at Christmas. They would let it be absorbed, folded in. His word again absorbed, like something you do to a stain rather than a person. And then he said the sentence that has not left me since, delivered so quietly I had to ask him to repeat it, which he would not do, so I am reconstructing it now from a single hearing and 61 years of context I didn't have until that Sunday, that the surviving child was given, in every practical way the family could arrange, a share of the place the other child would have held, so thoroughly, so completely that the surviving child would never have cause, growing up inside it, to ask what had been taken from her to make room. I sat with the phone against my ear a long time after he stopped talking. He did not tell me I was Francis's twin. He did not tell me anything so simple as that. He told me something with a shape I could not yet see the edges of, and hung up gently, in the particular careful manner of someone who said more than he meant to, and doesn't trust himself to stay on the line for what comes next. Paul drove out 2 days later, unannounced, the way our mother used to when she suspected one of us was in trouble. We wouldn't admit to over the phone. I was at the sink when his car came up the drive, soap still on my hands, my father napping in his chair with the game show murmuring at him that he wasn't watching. He knocked at the front door instead of coming around the back the easy way he always has, and when I let him in, he stood a moment in the hall looking at the piano, at the bare spot on top where the silver frame usually sits, because I had taken it down by then and hadn't yet found a way to put it back. We sat at the kitchen table a long while without talking, which is not how Paul and I have ever operated with each other. We've always been the kind of siblings who interrupt and finish each other's sentences badly. He finally said he remembered a detail he hadn't offered on the phone, something he'd apparently been sitting with for 2 sleepless nights before he trusted himself to drive it out here. A crib, carried out of the house on the back of a truck when he was small, and an aunt, not our mother, telling him it was going to a cousin who needed it. He believed that the plain, total way a 4-year-old believes whatever an aunt tells him for the better part of 6 decades. He put his hand flat on the table when he said it. The same gesture I would find myself making days later over a document he never got to see. And he didn't apologize for the years of redirecting me on the phone. He didn't need to. A crib leaving a house on a truck, for a reason nobody had ever explained to him, was apology enough. He'd also brought something, it turned out, folded into his jacket pocket with the particular care of a man who hadn't fully decided to show anyone, A hospital bill he'd found in our mother's cedar chest while looking, he said, for the deed to the North Field. Nothing to do with any of this. Or so he'd thought until he'd actually read it. It was itemized in the flat, clerical arithmetic of 1965, a lying-in charge, a pediatric consult, and then a line near the bottom, hand-totaled twice as though whoever paid it had checked the sum out of some need beyond arithmetic. 2 infant bassinets, hospital supplied, at the daily rate for a stay of 8 days. Not 1 bassinet, 2, billed together on a single family account, for the exact span of time between a birth I now had 2 independent records of, and a death I still had none. Paul set it on the table between us with the wary respect of a man handling something that might still be armed, and neither of us touched it again for a while. It told me the hospital at least had never once pretended there was only 1 baby to bill for, and that some ledger somewhere had known the truth of it in plain columns of numbers while the rest of the family's paper was already being quietly rewritten around it. Deb noticed something had shifted in me before I was ready to admit it to myself. She came for her regular Tuesday visit that same week, checked my father's blood pressure and his med chart the way she always does, and then sat with me at the counter afterward with her clipboard still open on her knee, studying my face longer than the visit strictly required. She asked gently whether the caregiving was wearing on me more than usual, whether I was sleeping, whether I wanted her to put in a referral for a support group that met Thursdays at the senior center. I told her I was fine, which was not true, and she didn't push, because pushing isn't really what her job asks of her. But she left the pamphlet on the counter anyway, face up, the way you leave a door unlocked for somebody you suspect might need it later, without wanting to say so directly. I kept the pamphlet in a drawer for 2 weeks without reading it, and I think about that drawer now more than I'd like to, because the truth is I wasn't unraveling from exhaustion at all, not the ordinary caregiver. Exhaustion Deb's whole professional life is built to recognize and treat. I was unraveling from being right about something no binder had a laminated page for. I played the recordings back that same week, sitting at the kitchen table where I'd made them. Headphones in, the sugar bowl still sitting where I'd propped the phone against it. I had listened to each conversation once already in the room in real time and thought I'd heard everything in them. I had not. It is a different thing entirely to hear your father's voice with nothing else competing for your attention. No toast to butter, no pill organizer to check, no reflexive redirect forming in your own mouth before he's even finished a sentence. On the recording from the second week, the one where he first mentioned checking on Francis before bed, there is a second detail I had not caught in real time. Because I was too busy managing the moment to actually receive it, he described, in the middle of that ordinary sentence, an afternoon light in the east window, gold and heavy, the specific color it only goes in October, and a lullaby with 1 nonsense word in it that belongs to no hymn or song I have ever been able to place. I have never told my father about my earliest memory. I have never told anyone the specific detail of that nonsense word, because I didn't have language for it myself until I heard it come out of his mouth, a syllable I would have sworn until that moment existed only in the private, unshareable interior of my own first memory, the one thing I believed was mine before anything else was. It is not a memory of me being sung to. I had always assumed the memory's geometry without ever checking it, the same unexamined confidence with which everyone assumes they're the hero of their own oldest story, without ever asking who else was in the room. I was standing at the door. I was the one too short to see over the rail. Someone else was in the crib, and my mother was singing to them, and I have spent 61 years quietly filing that scene under my mother, saying to me once, because it never once occurred to me, until an 87-year-old man with a failing mind handed the syllable back to me across a kitchen table, that the doorway in the crib might not have held the same child. I took the photograph down from the piano that same afternoon, still raw from the recording, and did something I had never once done in 61 years of dusting that frame. I opened the back of it. The cardboard backing had been in that frame so long it had gone the soft brown of a paper bag left in a drawer, and behind the visible print, tucked flat against the backing where 60 years of light had never reached it, was a second photograph. Same parlor, same wallpaper, same 2 bassinets. Unfaded because nothing had ever touched it but dark. And in the second bassinet, The one draped in a blanket and the print that had hung on that piano my whole life? A child. Awake. Eyes open toward the camera, the same as her sister's. In a photograph, someone had gone to the trouble of hiding behind another photograph, rather than simply throwing away, which told me, more than the register or the removal slip or the missing death record ever could, that whoever hid it hadn't been able to destroy it either. I brought both photographs to my father, the framed one and the hidden one, side by side, and set them in front of him at the kitchen table where the light was doing exactly what it does at 4 p.m. in that room. I don't know what reaction I expected. It was not the one I got, which was no surprise at all. A kind of tired, ancient relief, the look of a man finally allowed to put down a box he'd been holding since before I could walk. "We only had the one crib," he said, looking at the photograph rather than at me. "Your mother couldn't bear 2 after, so we made you carry her too." I asked him as gently as I have ever asked anyone anything in my life what he meant by carry. He was quiet long enough that I thought the window had already closed, that particular blankness settling in behind his eyes mid-sentence with no warning at all, the way it does now. Then he said in the plain, unhurried voice of a man reciting something he has turned over so many times in private that the words have worn smooth, that a person can only be told they lost a child so many times before they stop being able to hear it, and that somewhere in that unbearable stretch he and my mother had simply stopped being able to tell the difference out loud between the daughter they had and the daughter they didn't, because telling the difference meant saying the second one's name and saying her name out loud, even once, even just to correct the record, was more the mive doing Kime 5 warning 5 thing McIbe. He said it flatly, without any apparent horror at what he was describing. A thing that had simply happened to a family the way a flood or a bad winter happens to a family. And watching him, I could see that whatever guilt this had once carried had long ago worn down into something closer to grief, with all its edges, sanded off, livable, at least for him. In a way it was not yet livable for me. I'm going to tell you the rest of this plainly without dressing it up, because I have had some weeks now to sit with it, and I don't think it gets easier to say with better sentences. There was no entity in my father's kitchen. Nothing was studying me. No one had been building a file on me, and for anyone listening who's waiting for the turn where it becomes that kind of story, it never does. What was in that house was a family's grief, from that same year, handled the way grief was sometimes handled in small towns by people who loved each other and had almost no good tools for what had happened to them. A doctor willing to bend a record, a priest willing to pull a page from view rather than force a mother to see it, and 2 parents who made a decision in the rawest week of their lives that they then spent the next 60 years agreeing, silently, permanently, never to revisit. The county's records office called me on a Thursday, 3 weeks after I'd filed a routine request for any restored or reprocessed vital records under either name, a request I'd made more out of habit than hope, the same reflex that made me keep a notebook for Deb. The state had been slowly digitizing old withdrawn record boxes, the clerk explained, records that had been pulled from the active index decades ago at a family's request, but never actually destroyed, just filed in a different box in a basement nobody had opened in the intervening years. Mine had surfaced in that project. She was mailing me a copy. I felt less dread on that call than I expected to, and mostly recognition instead, the particular flat feeling of a test finally confirming a diagnosis you'd already privately made. I waited for that envelope the way you wait for a biopsy result, which is to say I checked the mailbox at times of day. I have never once in my life checked a mailbox, mid-morning, right after lunch, again before the mail truck could possibly have come a second time. When it finally arrived, I sat with it unopened on the kitchen table for the better part of an hour, my father napping in his chair in the next room, the same light doing the same slow October thing. It does every afternoon in that house, no matter what season the calendar actually claims. And I understood, sitting there with a sealed envelope in front of me instead of opening it, that some part of me already knew what it said and was simply giving the rest of me a little more time to be a woman who didn't know yet. I opened it a little after 4. The certificate that arrived is dated 8 days after the birth week I'd already confirmed twice over. 'Cause of death, failure to thrive. and in the box for the deceased's given name in a county clerk's plain, unhurried, entirely unremarkable handwriting, the kind of handwriting that has no idea it's about to detonate anything, is not Francis. It is Marianne. I sat with that longer than I can account for, because it takes a moment to understand what you're actually looking at. The baby who was baptized Francis, the one struck from the church register, is the baby who lived. The baby who died, 8 days after both of them were born, was recorded on the one document that goes in the ground with you under my name. Somewhere in that unbearable week, with 2 dying names to manage and only 1 living daughter to carry either of them forward, my parents chose, for reasons I will never fully have access to let the child who survived keep answering to the name that belonged, on paper, to the child who didn't. I have read that word more times now than I can count, at that same kitchen table in that same afternoon light, and I don't think I am going to arrive at a version of reading it that feels different from the first time. They chose which name went into the ground and which one kept living. In a week I have no memory of, and never will. And then they spent every day afterward making sure the child who lived answered so completely and so consistently to the name that stayed that she would never once have cause, in 61 years, to ask whether it had always been hers. I don't think my mother was cruel. I have turned that over more than anything else, and I keep landing in the same place. I think she was a woman who lost a child in a week when nobody around her had any language for how to lose a child, who was told by people she trusted that there was a mercy available to her if she wanted it, and who took it, and then had to live inside the shape of that choice every single day for the rest of her life, singing to a crib rail with her surviving daughter standing in the doorway not tall enough to see who she meant it for. And I do not know, and will never know now, which one of us she thought she was singing to by then, or whether by year 2 or 3, had simply stopped Matty on Wickip in Spain dis fair. My father called me Francis once, in the middle of May, on what turned out to be one of the last genuinely clear afternoons he had, before the tide came in further and took even the deep pass with it. He caught himself immediately, the way he always had, Marianne, forgive me my eyes, the same embarrassed laugh he'd used for every other slipped name since I'd arrived. I did not correct him back the way I would have that first week in April. I sat with it instead and understood, with no drama at all, sitting in my own kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, that the wrongness I was supposed to feel simply wasn't there anymore. It felt instead like a door I had walked past 10,000 times, finally admitting it had always had a hinge on that side. There is no ghost in this story, if that's what you came for. And I've tried to be honest about everything else, so I'll be honest about that too. I don't believe a dead infant has been haunting the parlor piano for 60 years, and I don't believe my father's mind was ever anything other than what 2 years of vascular damage made it. Failing, honestly. Exactly as failing as the binder said, on every subject except this one. What I can't get past, the 10% I have no tidy shelf for, is that on this one subject, the subject everyone in my family agreed for decades to treat as his most broken, he was not confused even slightly. He knew the tune. He knew the nonsense word. He knew the light. He knew a detail about a shared bassinet that exists nowhere on paper and that I have since confirmed gently with the one photography shop owner in Oberville old enough to have printed that roll of film all those decades ago, who remembered the reshoot without my prompting him at all. I don't know what to do with a man whose memory's dissolving in every direction except the one direction the whole family spent 60 years pointing him away from. I only know that it didn't dissolve there, and that I don't think that was an accident of the disease. I think some rooms in a mind get worn smooth by decades of not being visited, and some get worn the opposite way, deepened by the same neglect, the way a path gets more defined the longer nobody's allowed to walk across it and disturb the grass. I sat at that kitchen table the evening the certificate came, my father asleep in his chair in the next room and the last of the same east light that's been falling through that window my whole life, and I said both names out loud to the empty kitchen, once each, quietly. Marianne. Francis. I wasn't testing them for truth. There isn't one left to find. Every document that was ever going to surface has surfaced, and my father has, at most, a handful more clear afternoons in him, and none of the people who could tell me anything further are living except the one man upstairs, whose testimony started all of this, and who will not remember, tomorrow, that he gave it to me. I said both names because I am 61 years old, standing in my own kitchen in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and I have finally understood that I am the only one left who gets to decide which one of them I answer to for whatever years are left to either of us. I said them once each. Then I put the kettle on, because it was nearly 4 o'clock, and my father would be waking soon, and he has always liked his tea while the light is still doing what it does in that room. Gold and heavy and entirely unconcerned with what any of us have decided to call each other. And that's where she leaves it. The Graveyard Slot airs twice a week. New stories in the dead hours, wherever you're hearing this. If tonight kept you company, follow the show on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube. It matters more than it should. And if something ever happened to you, something you've been carrying, something nobody believed, write it down and send it in. The address is thegraveyardslot.com. We read them as written. Until next time, men, keep your porch light on, not because it helps, because it's polite to whatever's watching. This has been The Graveyard Slot. We're off the air.